Welcome to the Valley Today, a public service presentation of KAIL TV. We visit with Joe Collins in the radio and television business for 50 years. It's all next on the Valley Today. Welcome to the Valley Today. I got a special treat for you. I'm with a friend of mine who's been in the radio business for half a century. And he's been all over California. Actually, he's been all over the West Coast. My good friend, Joe Collins.
Good morning, Skippy. How are you? Good to see you.
Let's just give you a round of applause.
Yeah. Oh, thank you. Thank you very much.
What cut are you playing?
That's Red Price Sock and Hand Clapping from 1955.
Yeah?
Yeah.
So, you were born and raised in the Bay Area.
Well, I was born in San Luis Obispo, but my folks were living in San Francisco, but my mom came home to have me in San Luis. So in 1946, and so I was raised in a jazz house. My father was a jazz pianist, and he was the keyboardist for the Jack Ross Orchestra, who was the house band in the Venetian Room at the Fairmont Hotel in San Francisco. So I grew up in a house that was playing the record player all the time.
Yeah.
I remember one of the first tunes that I could hum to as a little kid was Salt Peanuts by Dizzy Gillespie. And when I was a little kid, I was told that Dizzy Gillespie came and visited the house, and I got to play around with him and stuff.
But you don't remember it?
I don't remember it. It's kind of like the 60s. But my father and Dave Brubeck grew up together. They were next-door neighbors in Concord, California, and it was Dave Brubeck's mother who taught both of them to play the keyboard. And so when they were all students at Mills College, along with Paul Desmond and Cal Jader, they studied under Darius Milhaud, who was one of the great students of Stravinsky. And so there was always music in the house, and Dave Brubeck and his wife and my mom and dad and I and their son Darius, who was their firstborn son, we all shared a flat together in the Mission District in San Francisco. And so there was a bunch of jazz people that used to come through the house, Paul Desmond and Cal Jader. When I was like 4, the first real big star I met was when Duke Ellington and Ella Fitzgerald played one of those big theaters on Market Street in San Francisco. Well, we went to see the Duke Ellington Orchestra and Ella Fitzgerald, and I fell in love with Ella Fitzgerald. And we went backstage after the show, and Ella Fitzgerald had me sitting on her lap, and I fell in love with her. I was like 4 years old at the time, and I wanted to take her home. I mean, I wanted her, to be mine.
Yeah.
And she said, "Oh, I'd love to go home with you, honey, but I've got to go." And so I cried because I couldn't take Ella Fitzgerald home with me.
That's a touching story. It really is.
Yeah.
So really, you've been in music your whole adult career.
Oh yeah.
Probably it was more from being a musician. You had musical roots as far as being able to play instruments.
Well, I played the bass guitar a little bit when I was in San Francisco, and I played the saxophone here when I moved to Fresno. I learned to play saxophone from Bill Bixler of the Wild Blue Yonder.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, but I never read a note of music.
The Bixlers, a famous local name.
Yeah.
Wild Blue Yonder.
Yeah, I spent a lot of time with them.
That's way back in the way back.
That was in the 70s, yeah. 70s and early 80s.
So now, how did you spring to radio?
My story is...
How old were you?
Okay, well, I got into radio professionally. My senior year in high school, I had just turned 18.
What year was that?
1964. And I was in San Luis Obispo, and I started on Sunday mornings from 10 to noon on KSLY in San Luis Obispo. I got my big break from John Borba, who was married to a cousin of mine through marriage. And so my mom and John cooked up to surprise me, and he invited me to come down to the radio station on Sunday morning and watch him do his show. So he said, "Come in at 9." So I came in at 9, and I sat there and watched him run the board. But 3 minutes to 10, he goes, "Oh, I'm kind of tired. Why don't you take over?" And so I was baptism by fire. And so I did my first show on the last Sunday of January of 1964. I had just turned 18. I was a senior in high school. And the first song I played in my professional career was "Dawn, Go Away, I'm No Good For You" by the Four Seasons.
Dawn, go away, I'm no good for you.
Followed up by this new band that had just come out from Liverpool, England, called the Beatles, and they said, "I think they got a future." And the second record I played was "I Saw Her Standing There," and I was off to the races.
Yeah.
And that was January of 1964. Fast forward 48 years, I'm still doing it.
You're still doing radio.
I'm
and
still-
you're
well,
doing
radio and-
television
yeah,
too.
radio,
because
television,
you're
and advertising,
You're
yeah.
the voice of some of the commercials that I've put together.
Oh yeah, we do a lot of work together.
Yes, we do.
Yeah. Now,
But we're not here to talk about
Yeah.
that. We're here to talk about you being in radio and all these people that have come and gone from your life.
Oh yeah.
All these famous musicians. I mean, the list is immense.
In
Joe Cocker, Van Morrison,
Oh yeah.
Otis Redding, Smokey
Yeah.
Robinson.
Yeah.
So what was the first artist that you met that you thought? Well, it must have been Ella Fitzgerald, right?
Oh yeah, Ella Fitzgerald was
That was
a
it.
monster at the
I mean,
time.
that must have really set the tone.
Oh
for,
yeah, I mean, because she was the queen.
yeah,
Yeah, and the Duke Ellington band. I mean, it didn't get any better than that.
right. And you saw them perform.
Oh yeah, I saw Duke Ellington's band perform actually 3 different times in my life.
Yeah,
And but in 1961, when I was a sophomore in high school, this guy had just moved out to California, to San Luis Obispo from New Jersey. His name was Johnny Barbada. He was a drummer, and he'd never had a lesson in his life. He was a natural. And he and I clicked. We hit it right off. And
you were high school buds.
yeah, we were high school buds.
Yeah,
And-
San Luis Obispo.
in San Luis Obispo, and he got into a band called the Sentinels, which was one of the Central Coast surf bands.
Yeah.
And they used to play at the Pismo Beach Veterans Memorial Hall. And then later they went on and play at the Rose Garden Ballroom down there by the pier. And there was a band out of Arroyo Grande called the Biscaynes, which was always in the Battle of the Bands every year, what they would have in the Central Coast against the Sentinels and a few other bands. And they had a lead singer, and he called himself Chuck Rondell, young basketball player out of Arroyo Grande, who I went to college for a year down at Allen Hancock College in '64 and '65. And he used to sing at the surf band, and he was a real clean-cut kid. Well, fast forward to about 1968, a band comes out called Three Dog Night, and the lead singer's name is Chuck Negron, who in reality was the kid I grew up with, Chuck Rondell.
Rondell, he changed his name.
And he changed his name and became Chuck Negron, and of course they had a string of hits.
So-
Johnny Barbada went on to be, and this is an interesting, because I have a interesting history and tie with the Turtles, because Johnny went on to become the drummer with the Turtles. On the first record he was on was You Baby, and the follow-up with the Happy Together, and they had a string of hits that Johnny did the drums for. And then Mark Volman and Howard Kalin, who were the leaders of the Turtles, great harmonies, they became Flo and Eddie, the Fluorescent Leach and Eddie, real talented guys, and we did a show called Flo and Eddie by the Fireside on Sunday nights on KMET in Los Angeles, and I was the producer of that show for a little over a year, and so I have history with 3 different guys in the Turtles.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah.
So let's take us through your radio career. Where you started where?
January 1964 at KSLY in San Luis Obispo. And then at the end of spring, I went to the middle of the road station, KVEC, which played Dodger baseball and Paul Harvey in the news and Howard Cosell speaking of sports.
Yeah.
And I did a show on Friday and Saturday night called The Late Late Affair, where I played jazz. You know, and
that was an FM?
that was an AM station,
It was an AM
920
station.
AM. Yeah, and now it's a news talk station
Right.
over on the Central Coast. But KVEC was the big historical station in San Luis Obispo.
So then you went to San Francisco?
I went from there back to KSLY, where I did the afternoon show through 1965. The end of '65, I resigned to go get my FCC first class engineer's license so I could work at bigger stations. And I got my first class license, spent 6 months in Lompoc at KNAZ. I hated it there. It was like out on the edge of nowhere. But I left
think it still
Lompoc at the
is.
end of May, and June 20th, 1966, I got my big break. And thanks to my mentor, Bobby Dale, I ended up at KFRC in San Francisco. And I stayed there for 7 years and produced the morning show.
Yeah. So you were at KFRC for quite a
For
quite a
7
while.
years, yeah, as a producer engineer. But I also moonlit at a FM hippie underground station in San Rafael, KTIM, which was in the Independent Journal building.
Where things were a little more relaxed.
Oh yeah. And we would get guests come in. The Grateful Dead, we were kind of like their official station. The Grateful Dead used to
'cause
listen.
they were local
Because they were
band.
all lived up in Marin County.
Right.
And then guys like, who's the I'm blanking, on the cover of the Rolling Stone, Dr. Hooked in the Medicine Show.
Yeah.
They would come in and they would do like live sets of music on my show, and I would interview them. And then I met their writer, Shel Silverstein, who wrote children's books, but he also wrote, Sylvia's mother and things like that. Yeah, and so that was an interesting part of my life.
Yeah, and then from there, so
I
7
left.
years, then you went to Portland.
Went to Portland, Oregon,
Yeah.
to become the program director of a 100,000-watt quadraphonic FM hippie underground station,
Wow.
KQIV.
Wow.
And while I was there, Flo and Eddie came as guests on my show,
Yeah.
and I told them of my history with Johnny Barbada and all that stuff. Of course, they were all suing each other at the time
Right.
because they got ripped off by the bad management of White Whale Records, and but then I would later end up hooking up with Flo and Eddie, and they hooking up with me when I was at KMET. So they have been in and out of my life several times.
What was the call letters up at Portland?
KQIV.
KQIV.
Yeah.
And that was a 100,000-watt
Quadraphonic, yeah.
And those were rare.
Very rare.
There was a couple
and
of quadraphonics.
The FCC could not settle on what format, because there was the matrix format and then there was some other format in quad, and they didn't come up with they never had a set standard for, well, here's the standard for quadraphonic.
Yeah.
So it just kind of, it went away.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then from KQIV,
Then I went to Los Angeles and ended up at KMET in November 1973.
and how'd you get that gig?
I was at the right place at the right time, and
Yeah.
I had a fairly good history behind me, and they liked my
Probably
resume.
had a good
Had a
air
good
check.
resume. Well, yeah, I got lucky.
Yeah.
Yeah, I rolled a tape on one of my fortunately good days.
But KMET is where it really hit the fan. I mean, this is where, the radio's changing, and you're there. There's artists coming in and out because it's the mecca for recording also. So you're in this hot station.
Right. And that year, 1974, a few months after I started there, they promoted me to become the music director of the station. So suddenly, it was like, everybody was coming through my office and through my life. And at the end of 1974, Billboard magazine awarded KMET the radio station of the year for the entire country.
So Ian Dury's Sex and Drugs and Rock and Roll, it probably summed it up.
Well, yeah, there was a lot of that on the periphery also.
And so
yeah.
in 74, you were, 28 years old?
Let's see, in 74, I was about 27, 28 years old. Yeah, 28.
So it was just a beautiful thing.
Oh, yeah.
You must have been on top of the world.
Well, I loved working in Los Angeles, but I hated living there, because you don't really live in Los Angeles, you exist.
Right.
And it's such a hassle to drive from one point to another. I mean, I would spend sometimes a half an hour to drive 8 to 10 miles.
Yeah.
Depending on what time of the day
Yeah.
it was.
But you were commuting from Santa Barbara, weren't you?
Well, I was commuting from Santa Barbara, and then I got a place in Santa Monica.
How long was that? Was that a couple hour commute?
Oh, it was about a 95 to 100-minute drive. you know,
Yeah.
And
but
then I
just
moved.
always beautiful, because you'd see the ocean going and you'd see the ocean
yeah,
coming.
and yeah, driving along by Rincon and stuff, it was great. But I settled in Santa Monica and rented a house with a couple of other people. So I lived upstairs from Ace Young, who was the news director at KMET. So we lived right next to each other.
Yeah.
So we spent a lot of time together, and we're still friends to this day. Met him in 1973, so I've known him for 40 years? Yeah, about 40 years.
Very cool.
Yeah.
You know what? This is a natural place for us to take a break.
Okay.
Why don't you take us out, and we'll be right back right after this brief message. Welcome back to the Valley today. We are with my old friend Joe Collins. I've known him for, 20 years now?
About 20 years, yeah.
We've been working together in television, and but more importantly, he comes from a radio genre. And thanks for being on our show.
Thank you for having me.
And it's cool to talk to you, because you're the connection. All these people that, I idolized when I was young, all these rock and rollers, we just looked, they were on a pedestal.
Yeah.
And you got to meet a lot of these people.
Oh, yeah. Matter of fact, I just read in the paper this morning, because I met the likes of Otis Redding, Dionne Warwick, Van Morrison, Sam the Sham of the Pharaohs. I met them in the 60s when I was at KFRC in San Francisco. In 1974, I'm at KMET, which is a big album rock station, and so we appealed more to the hip group than the pop music group.
Right.
And through the station came the likes of Smokey Robinson, who had been my idol as a kid, ever since I was like in junior high school, from the days of like Shop Around and things like that. We used to play that at weekend parties at people's houses and stuff, and dance slow and stuff to the Miracles. And I also he came to the station one day, even though he wasn't an album rock artist, and it was already kind of past his big prime. He was doing rock reunion shows and memory shows, oldie shows. But Bobby V showed up at the radio station one day, and we spent an entire afternoon together, and I blew him away with the knowledge of his background, and I knew his history, and named off all of his songs to him, and that Snuff Garrett had been his producer, and a lot of the songs had been written by Carole King and Jerry Goffin, and he was a humble, charming guy. He grew up in the Midwest in Fargo, North Dakota, and I just read in the paper this morning that he's been diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease, which is really sad, because a really sweet, humble guy.
Yeah, and a talent, too.
Oh, great talent. They used to do a thing where he would harmonize his voice with it, and so it'd be double tracking his voice, and it was just great. And they'd use the orchestra, the studio band at Liberty was Felix Slatkin and his strings, and of course Snuff Garrett was a genius as far as producing pop music.
Now you're throwing names out there that I'm not familiar with. Some I am. Joe Cocker.
Joe Cocker, I met him on the Mad Dogs and Englishmen tour. He came through the radio station to KFRC, and that's when he was with that whole caravan with Leon Russell and Rita Coolidge and Eric Clapton and Delaney and Bonnie and people like that.
Yeah. Van Morrison.
Van Morrison I met when he was still with them in 1966.
Oh, he was touring with them?
He was their lead singer.
Oh, okay. Tell me a little bit about the Mad Dogs and Englishmen tour.
It was a pretty chaotic tour.
Who were the principals?
Well, it was Leon Russell and Joe Cocker, but they also had taken on that caravan tour. Eric Clapton was in that band. You had Chris Stainton was the other keyboardist, along with Leon Russell. Rita Coolidge was on that tour. Delaney Bramlett and Delaney and Bonnie Bramlett, they were on the tour. So it was they made a movie out of it, Mad Dogs and Englishmen.
Yeah. And so moving down the line, Keith Moon and Roger Daltrey, and you also met Pete Townsend.
Well, I met Pete Townsend in the 60s when I was at KFRC. We went to a special reception at the Fillmore West Auditorium at the corner of Market and Van Ness. We went in there for an afternoon, and they had a special press gathering. But a couple years later, MCA Records, because I was the music director at KMET, asked if I would come in as their guest and do an interview out at Universal Studios in one of their big studio theaters with Keith Moon that they were going to play back on the King Biscuit Flower Hour, which was a Sunday night radio.
That was a hot show. I remember listening to that.
So I spent a day with Keith Moon, and they took us in a limousine and had lunch, and he was a really, everybody talked about how crazy he was, because he used to do stuff like tear up hotel rooms.
Well, he was crazy when he was drinking.
Yeah, when he drank, he would drive cars into swimming pools and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And
that was hard on cars.
But the day we spent together, he was a complete, total gentleman, very charming, and just a really gentle, sweet guy.
Wow.
And a very talented drummer, too.
And also...
and then Roger Daltrey came by one afternoon at the radio station and was a guest on my show, and he was wonderful. Real nice guy.
Yeah. Massive talent. You've got Rod Stewart here.
Rod Stewart, I spent a couple days with I think 1975, and he came by and I interviewed him on my show at KMET, and then the next night, a friend of mine who was the manager for John Mayall came by and picked me up in a limousine and picked up Rod Stewart, and we went to a private party somewhere in West Hollywood.
Very cool.
Yeah. And Rod Stewart called me Sport.
He called you Sport?
Yeah, he liked me and he called me Sport.
Yeah?
Yeah. I think he called me Joe once, but the rest of the time he called me Sport.
That's when he was really, his popularity was...
He was wearing the leopard skin stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a good look for some people.
Yeah.
You've got George Benson.
George Benson came by, and I used to do a weekly jazz show on K-Tide in Santa Barbara that I produced in my studio in Santa Monica. And George Benson was real hot at that time on the CTI label. This is before he had This Masquerade and Nature Boy and things like that. So he was more of just a guitar player, not a singer yet. And he came by, CTI Records sent him over to my studio. We spent an afternoon where I got to interview him, and a real quiet, very quiet, kind of reserved guy.
How about the Woodstock era? You've got some artists here from the Woodstock era. Arlo Guthrie
and Hoyt Axton one afternoon came by together as a team, because they were pals, and came by and visited me at KMET. And what surprised me was Arlo Guthrie, who at that time was sang Alice's Restaurant, and so he appealed to the hippies. And yet I understand that these days he's quite conservative in his political beliefs.
He's from Massachusetts, I believe.
Yeah, and then Hoyt Axton.
That's a real liberal state.
And then Hoyt Axton, who was just a good old boy, and actually I met several country people. I met Hoyt Axton while I was at KMET, Charlie Daniels, Freddie Fender, Waylon Jennings came through the station along with his wife Jessie Coulter. They were good friends of a guy I worked with, Jimmy Rabbit. I met Waylon through Jimmy Rabbit.
Who was Jimmy Rabbit?
Jimmy Rabbit was one of the disc jockeys on the station, and a big talent in Los Angeles. Plus, he was also a country music artist. And so he recorded a couple albums on Capitol Records. He now lives up in Grand Junction, Colorado.
So working at KMET, that had to be fairly surrealistic.
Well, Shadow Stevens was the one who appointed me music director, and Shadow and I are still friends to this day. We stay in touch by email.
So Shadow was in on this in the mid-'70s.
Oh, yeah. Shadow came out from Boston in 1969 and was a weekender at KHJ, and then he went to KRLA, and then he came over to KMET.
Because he's had a career in television also, but
he's the voice on the Craig Ferguson show, that late night show.
More importantly, he's got his start in radio.
Oh, yeah. I used to do the Federated commercials, Fred Rated, which were classic. They were brilliant.
Yeah, everybody, from my era, remembers those, certainly. You've got Robert Palmer.
Robert Palmer. I broke Robert Palmer's first hit in Los Angeles.
Now, when you say break, what does that mean?
Meaning I was the first one to play it in the country.
Yeah.
He had an import album. It was a British release on Island Records called Sneakin' Sally Through the Alley. Was his first album. The backing group, it was not a studio group. It was a band that was successful on their own, Little Feat, my all-time favorite rock and roll band. And they were insulted because Robert Palmer wanted them to become his band. And they go, why? Why should we? Because we're already, making records on our own.
Right.
But they backed him for years.
Yeah.
And, the great Lowell George, slide guitar, Paul Barrere, Billy Payne, a great keyboard player. It's a wonderful, wonderful group, which I've seen several times in concert. Unfortunately, we lost Lowell George in 1979. But the band is still together to this day, and I saw them a year ago in Santa Barbara, and they're as good as ever.
You've also got Graham Nash, Neil Young, Grace Slick. Tell us about anything about Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young.
I saw them before Neil joined up with the band in 1969 when they came out with that first album. They played the Fillmore Auditorium, and I got to see them, and they were wonderful.
They skyrocketed, didn't they? They just came out of obscurity.
Well, no, they didn't come out of obscurity. They all came out of the groups, because David Crosby came out of the Byrds.
Right.
Stephen Stills was Buffalo Springfield.
Right.
And Graham Nash had been in the Hollies.
Right. So all of this talent coming together. What a great marriage of these different
the harmonies. It was like birds singing in a tree.
Right.
It was just incredible.
4-part harmonies.
Yeah.
Very nice. Very nice. David Bowie.
Christmas week of 1974. I'm at KMET.
What was his hit in 1974?
He had just come out with that Young Americans album, and he had Fame and Young Americans.
Yeah.
And
Really powerful.
Oh yeah, because it was a duet with John Lennon, Fame.
Yeah.
And so Christmas week.
Well, Lennon was on that track?
Lennon was on Fame.
I did not know that.
that was David Bowie and John Lennon together. And Christmas week of 1974, I'm on the air doing the afternoon show at KMET, and suddenly there's a knock on the booth door, and I unlocked it, and it opens up, and in walks David Bowie, who was real slender. They used to call him the Thin White Duke. Yeah. Real slender, and he's wearing a trench coat.
Real pasty.
And he walked, and his skin was just pasty white, and he'd been living at like the Beverly Hilton Hotel working on his next album. And he walked in with a bottle of, French wine and a book of poems, and he says, "I just wanted to wish you Merry Christmas and thank you for playing my record." And then he left.
Oh, and also the winners, Edgar and Johnny.
Oh, yeah, 1976. I'm the program director at KFIG when they're down in the Del Webb building, and Johnny and Edgar Winter were going to play a concert at the Selland Arena the next night. A day before the concert, they came by and I was doing the afternoon show, and I interviewed them, and they were just good old down-home boys. And when it was done, they had nothing to do, so they came home with me, and we spent 3 hours at my dining room table and just had a great evening talking about the roots of music and the blues people that they grew up listening to in Texas, because that's where they were from, was Texas.
Well, Joe, rock and roll, hoochie coo. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Skippy.
It was a real pleasure talking to you, and we could go on for hours about the people and places, and what an amazing career.
Yeah, and I'm blessed that even though I don't have a radio show currently, I have an immense backlog of music and archives, and I'm waiting for my next opportunity.
Well,
but in the meantime, I'm staying busy with my advertising agency and my commercials, and I've had a rich background of this for 48 years, and a lot to be grateful for.
Yeah. Well, you can hear him locally on radio and television. Joe Collins. This is the Valley Today.